All right, well, let's get started at 6:30. Thanks for your patience, but we wanted to hold off on beginning so that we had all the guests that we invited and had time to arrive. So thank you very much for coming to the book launch event for Digital Dharma, Recovering Wisdom. I imagine that by now all of you have had a chance to admire the book. It's a beautiful tome full of wonderful pictures, certainly the best document of our founder, Gene Smith. It's not a complete cradle-to-grave biography, but that's all right because Kelsang Lhamo here has just finished one in the Tibetan language that will be published soon. But it is a wonderful pictorial biography of Gene with never-before-seen photos of him from his youth, great stories of his middle period when he lived in India and reprinted tens of thousands of volumes of text, but it especially focuses on the later period, 2007, 8, 9, 10, when the fruits of TBRC were starting to blossom. And once Gene had a critical mass of text that he had digitally scanned, he then couldn't wait to rush back to his Lama friends in India and Nepal to hand deliver to them hard drives containing thousands of volumes with multiple editions of the Buddhist canon, and then all of the collected works of so many important masters. And he did all of this work in order to keep the tradition alive and promote the sustainability of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And of course, the scholars here in the room are also beneficiaries of his work. Gene was also thinking of supporting and expanding and stimulating research into Tibetan Buddhism. So we're going to learn a lot more about Gene tonight, so I won't say anything more than that other than we're here to celebrate the launch of the book. Now, about the book itself, this is more or less BDRC's COVID project. It was in February of 2020 that myself, Daphne Yakin, whose name is there prominent on the book, and Patricia Gruber, a longtime supporter of BDRC, got together in Pat Gruber's New York apartment. And we said, we're probably not going to be traveling that much anytime soon. We have all of this unused material that was produced when Daphne followed Gene around in 2008 and 9 to film him giving out these hard drives. Let's make use of the video clips and the photography and produce a book. This is Gene's the 10th anniversary of his passing. The 25th anniversary of BDRC is coming up. So let's create a really important memento that we can all have to keep his memory alive, share it with the next generation, and to teach people about this work. So we didn't know what was coming, but we thought that we would have some amount of time to devote to the book. Well, the pandemic, in a sense, is still going on, but we spent 2 years of concentrated time meeting pretty regularly on Zoom and also in person once that became safe. And through a lot of trial and error, we selected the photographs, set up the design, wrote the text, the captions, the inserts, and so forth, and we're really pleased with the final product. So Daphne Yakin is the real creative director behind the work. Patricia Gruber supported it financially. Arthur Fishman is Daphne's longtime co-writer, and he contributed mightily to the book. Tenzin Dickie and myself of BDRC also did a lot of work on it, but Daphne, Arthur, and Pat deserve the lion's share of the credit. And now, just because we sat around and worked on the book doesn't mean that it's going to get published. We needed a cooperative publisher as well, and so this book was published by Wisdom Publications, and it wouldn't be the same without their editorial advice, interventions, and bringing it to print. So we're really grateful for them. Daniel Aiken, the current CEO and publisher of Wisdom, is on our board and helped with it. And we're so fortunate tonight to have his predecessor, Tim McNeill, here. But I'll introduce him a little more later. So the book is available for sale if you would like at a slight discount. Please take a look afterwards. We can swipe your card and send you home with a copy. But we're not here to sell books, just to have the book as an occasion for getting together and celebrating the BDRC community. All right, so that's my introduction, welcoming you here. Now I just want to briefly introduce the 4 panelists tonight, or speakers. So we have, just going in order, from my left, Tim McNeill, who was a longtime CEO and publisher of Wisdom Publications, and one of the co-founders of TBRC, BDRC at the time, and we'll hear about that momentarily. And then Professor Leonard van der Kuijp of Harvard University, a renowned scholar of Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan history, and one of the other really seminal co-founders of the organization, along with Jean and Tim. And then Professor Janet Gyatso is here as well, longtime board member, such a close friend of Jean and the organization, and a influential scholar and figure, certainly in the Tibetan Buddhist studies here in the Boston area. Lastly, Kelsang Lhamo, another veteran of TBRC and BDRC. Kelsang Lhamo was the first full-time hire at the organization. In fact, I think when you first started working, you were being paid under the table, because the whole payroll situation hadn't been figured out. But Kelsang Lhamo has been with the organization from the beginning and is probably the most knowledgeable of our institutional history, and even more important than that, our archive. On a daily basis, I write to her and say, do we have this? What's the matter with that? What's the story behind this text? She has it all in her mind, and we're hoping to get more and more of that down on the page, so that other people can enjoy the fruits of all of her research. But at any rate, such as illustrious group of people to share their stories and experiences with Jean. And without further ado, why don't we begin? I thought that Leonard could start, because he met Jean before, I think, anyone else here in the room present. And so I've asked him to share some stories about what it was like to be a junior scholar in Kathmandu and India in the 70s and 80s, meeting Jean, and benefiting from his knowledge, his library, and his connections. Thank you, Jean.
Leonard, that was okay. Well, it's very nice to be here, obviously. Thank you, Jann, for inviting me. Yeah, I'm not that old, but I did meet Jean a long time ago. I was also a junior person, at times maybe a groupie even. But can you hear me?
Hang around.
Pardon? Closer to my mouth? Okay. So the first time I heard of Jean was when I was a student in Saskatchewan, Saskatoon, University of Saskatchewan, and he became very quickly a legend. Then we found an article published by him in Kailash under a pseudonym, which one of the persons who knew him well, the late Stephen Goodman, told me was actually Jean Smith, and that was an article that he published under the pseudonym of Jamna Namgyal. He himself was not able to publish anything officially because of restrictions that the Library of Congress office put on him. At that time, of course, he was already the field director of the Library of Congress office in New Delhi. He started working there as a local hire for a couple hundred rupees a month, quickly rose through the hierarchy, and ultimately his skills and his aptitude and his knowledge and his kind then became the field director of this very large organization with more than 100 people worked there. He's, as some of you know, he's responsible for launching the Appeal for 80 program, by means of which 7,000 or 8,000 volumes of Tibetan texts were published. And if you go look back there, that's the entrance to the Gene Smith Library at Southwestern Nationalities University. And there's a bust of Gene. The doors are locked. Access is almost impossible to gain to this library, but it's there, and so 7,000 or so 8,000 volumes of books are located there. It's unfortunate, but that's just the way it is right now. Things will change. Everything changed, as the Buddha himself said. So this will also change, but right now it doesn't seem very likely they'll change in the near future. So Gene was kind of a myth. He was a mythical figure for most of us fledgling Tibetan studies students. Then when I moved to Hamburg University, a bunch of us decided to photograph or scan or photocopy, really photocopy. There was no scanning at the time. Photocopy all the introductions to the books that Gene Smith had written under his own name, and this we did. And we thought of maybe putting this together in kind of do-it-yourself binders and distributed among other students in our immediate environment. Of course, this never happened, but we had piles and piles of photocopies of his introductory material. Then I came back to the States, and I had to do some other work, and I started studying something else because I figured I'd never get a job, and all of a sudden ended up in Nepal. And in Nepal, I first met Gene when he came to visit, and somehow he'd heard of me. I was working with the Nepal-German Manuscript Preservation Project. He'd somehow heard of me and came in for a visit, and we became very good friends ever since that time. This must have been 1980 or 81, because I came to Nepal in 1980. And I visited him several times at his home, and his home was always an open kind of situation where people would come in and come out. Sometimes stay for 3 weeks, some stay for a month, sometimes stay for 2 months, getting free room and board, and some people, I'm sure, took advantage of Gene's generosity. Of course, Gene had two major teachers. That's Tenzin Dickie on that side, and Kelsang Lhamo on the other side. Another one was Noryang Rinpoche of the Tupakaji, whom I saw playing soccer in his bare feet at Gum Monastery a long, long time ago in the early 1980s, and I didn't know who he was. And then Gene told me, "Oh, that must have been Noryang Rinpoche." I said, "Oh, really?" He says he's one of the most learned individuals in the Tupakaji tradition. Anyways, Gene knew everybody. And Kelsang Lhamo Tim Kelsang Lhamo would stay in his house for a month, 2 months, together with his entourage. Gene would sleep on the couch or go in the hotel, and Kelsang would sleep on Gene's bed. This was Gene. Gene opened his library to people who visited him, and people went in and out in the library making copies and so on. At that time in Delhi, you had copy machines that were about the size of this room. A little exaggerated, but they were huge, and it would take maybe 3, 4, 5 minutes to get one copy made. Some of you may remember that. And then very often, you take the paper out, and all the ink drops off. You have a blank sheet. So it was not the best quality of photocopying. Anyway, so I met Gene many times in Nepal. One time he came over, and this was just before Tihar, which is kind of Nepalese New Year. And at that time, Tihar Dasain is Durga Puja, as you can imagine. Durga Puja and the worship of Durga, which is a very bloody affair, and many animals get sacrificed to Durga. But at the same time, it's also Tihar, and that's Nepalese New Year. And people then do all kinds of things and play especially cards, and also Sho. And Sho is a game with a number of shells, and in 15 seconds, the game is over. One game is over, and then the money gets changed in hands because it's a gambling kind of game. Anyways, Gene and Peter Burley, then chargé d'affaires of the U.S. Embassy in Kathmandu, an old friend of Gene's, because Gene had traveled all over Nepal and India in the early 1960s, and at that time Peter Burley was there with the Peace Corps. And so he visited, and Jean visited, and we all went, did the rounds with various people, various individuals. Jean bought himself a block print of the collected writings, collected biographies of, I think it was the Dalai Lamas, and also the Panchen Lamas. But we ended up at a very interesting place. This was the home of Rishikesh Shah. And Rishikesh Shah had been in jail for various reasons. He was a very well-to-do person and a very interesting man. And we visited his home for New Year's. We knocked on the doors opened, and the Brahmin servant came out and said, "Yes, please come in." And at the far end of the room, there was a very voluminous lady, was sitting there surrounded by a bunch of younger men, apparently all servants of the house. And they would play a card. In this case, they were playing cards. And then all of a sudden, somebody from downstairs came above, whispered something in her ear, and she said, "Diksha, okay, fine," and went back down again. This person apparently was there to allow another person who was playing downstairs to get credit because he was losing money. So she controlled the entire situation. Then we went downstairs, and there we saw Rishikesh Shah with a bunch of other people playing shot. And I must confess, I've never seen so much money change hands in so little time. And this is Nepal, huh? This is Nepal, yeah.
So what was Jean doing?
They were just sitting there. We're just sitting there, hanging out, just watching it and having a good time.
It looked like a lot of money, but it was rupees.
It was.
Did Jean put the money?
No, we didn't play. They playing with 1,000 rupee bills. 1,000 rupee bills. This is a lot of money at that time. And stacks of 1,000 rupee bills. Anyway, so I spent a lot of very nice times with Jean and also with my classmate Christoph Kuipers. We visited Jean several times in his home in Delhi, where, of course, we were also greeted by a man called Mangaram. And Mangaram was Jean's servant, friend, Shapchi. Enabler. He ran the household. And when he didn't like somebody, he would let them know that he didn't like that person. So some of the people who visited Jean were a little bit annoyed at Mangaram because Mangaram didn't treat them as they felt they should be treated. Mangaram then, Jean actually paid for his education. And Jean is this kind of person, right? It's just a really unusual man. Sorry, Jean was kind of an unusual person. And so he kind of basically raised Mangaram from when he was 9 or 10 or 12 years old. Or 8 years old? 8 years old. Yeah. And paid for his education. And then ultimately, Mangaram ended up getting married. He paid for the wedding. And Mangaram is now, in his 60s. His sons have now grown up. They're married too. It's a really remarkable story. So Jean has left many very interesting traces behind. And of course, the BDRC was his dream child. And look at what it has become now under direction of various people and also recently under direction of Jann Ronis. So we have so many new texts that we can access. Just marvelous. There's nothing like it. There's never been a library in Tibet like the one we have now in BDRC. Never. Which makes things very difficult for those of us who are interested in reading Tibetan text because they're just too much. I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
I guess I'm up. It's always an honor to be in the position of talking about Jean. So thank you very much for inviting me. I met Jean much later in 1998. I had been running Wisdom for about 10 years at that point, and friends of mine who had just completed their doctorates at Harvard, John Dunn and Sarah McClintock, who were good friends. I think you were advisor to both, if I'm not mistaken. Or at least
Tom Tillmans was.
Yes, and he factors into this. So they came to me at some point. We were good friends, and they said, "Tim, Wisdom's kind of considered a confessional publisher, and they didn't mean that in a necessarily favorable way. They said, but you really should, in order for you to publish the young scholars, and there were more and more of them coming up, you really need to establish a scholarly series or just more credibility, if you will. So they were working on their postdoc with Tom Tillemans and University of Lausanne in Switzerland, and they came back and visited me with Tom, and we strategized starting these studies in Indian and Tibetan Buddhism, and a number of these people here are on the advisory board. And so John at that time came to me. He said, Tim, there's this guy, this is 1998. He said, Tim, there's this guy, Gene Smith. He's in New York now, and you better get to him before somebody else does. And I'm going, okay, I don't know who this guy is, but I know what John meant. He meant, a competitor, if you will. So I can't remember exactly how this happened, but the idea was Gene, and you didn't get into much detail, but Gene's introductions and the prefaces that he had to write because he was cataloging these books using PL 480 money. And for those of you that don't know, PL is Public Law 480, and these countries like India, we were helping, but they didn't have convertible currency. They didn't have dollars to pay for stuff. So this PL 480 public law allowed countries to pay the United States in local currencies. Well, it was in convertible currency, so we were stockpiling United States rupees in India, and they needed to be used in countries. So we were paying for ambassador, all of the offices and the people and the whatever. And Gene, I believe, was the one that came up with the brilliant ideas. I can use these monies to save Tibetan texts. And these lamas, as Leonard was saying, they were just coming and showing up and bringing him, who knows, maybe the last or extant copy of whatever manuscript it happened to be. And Gene was photographing several pages on a page and creating these big, if you've ever seen the original PL 480s, and they were to be deposited in university libraries. And I think there were like a dozen libraries that were part of this, but they couldn't catalog them unless they had introductions and prefaces in English. So they, basically people knew what it was. And Gene wrote all these introductions, prefaces, and it turned out this is like the most valuable information that was out there in many ways. And so graduate students were photocopying it and passing this along, and this was like your study material if you were a graduate student in Tibetan studies at the time. That was kind of a tangent right there, but in any event, so I get teamed up with Curtis Schaefer, who was at at the time in 1988, Leonard student who he lured from Seattle, I understand, and I didn't know Curtis, and at the time I really hadn't met you yet, and Curtis shows up at my office. We get together. We're going to go down to this meet this fellow Gene Smith in New York City, and he had just been lured out of retirement from the Library of Congress and was set up in New York in an old converted firehouse with all his massive collection of Tibetan texts. And it was a beautiful building. And so Curtis and I take the train down, and we were approaching him or soliciting his permission to publish the PL 480 collection into a book, right? And Curtis was going to be the editor, and of course we were bona fide because we were friends of Leonard, coming to ask Gene of this, and he was very self-effacing, as anyone that knows Gene knows that he was. And he said, sure, I don't know who'd be interested in that, but yeah, you go ahead and do that. And he didn't want royalties. He said, fine. So I'm sort of jumping ahead, but he was set up in this very nice situation, but hold on. Gene was like Mecca. People would go on Hajj to see him there. And I heard of people, I didn't know Janet at the time either, but I remember hearing, oh, Janet's coming here, and Hopkins and this one and Capstein, all these people that were the sort of that generation of Tibetan scholars were going to see Gene, right? So I'm learning more and more about this guy. So Curtis and I show up, Gene agrees, and then at the end, we finish the thing. He said, well, let's go down to the corner of this Irish pub and we'll have a drink. So we go down and we're sitting at the bar and I'm chatting with Gene, and Leonard already said this, but it is true. Gene knew everybody. Well, I was in the Peace Corps in Afghanistan before anyone knew where Afghanistan was, from 73 to 77. I'm sitting there talking to Gene, and he's going like, oh, did you know who? Did you know so? He's just rattling off names of people from the Peace Corps in Afghanistan from the mid 70s that were friends of his. It was impressive, to say the least, right? So at the time, I'm thinking, wow, he knows everyone. Everyone's coming to him. I happened to need an editor at the time. And so I said to Gene, listen, if you know of anyone, please, and let me know, because I'm looking for someone for this. And I know you know everyone. Everyone knows you. So, we came back, we got permission to do the book, come back to my office, and within weeks I get an email from Gene that says, Tim, are you still looking for an editor? I know someone who knows the literature very well, but he doesn't have a lot of editing experience. He knows the language and literature, but not a lot of editing experience. And I just wrote back, yes, I am. I'm still looking. And my next email was, it's me. He would have gotten it right. Is it I or is it me? So I was like, there was no hesitation whatsoever, and totally agreed to it. And the thing about Gene was, Gene, you don't just move Gene, you move his library. So we arranged a 40-foot tractor trailer truck to move his 400 boxes of Tibetan manuscripts. And fortunately, another board member of mine, Brent Farmer, ran a publishing company in Watertown Square, and he had a big dry basement that we could store Gene's books in. And he came, he was working for Wisdom, and I don't know, probably went on for couple of years, 2.5 years all told. But it was clear from the beginning that Gene, he was doing a full, honorable job for Wisdom, totally everything that needed to be done full time. But he was also full-time Gene Smith at night. Everyone was coming to him asking about this text or that person. If you asked Gene about a text, he told you about the person's disciple and about their teachers. And it was just, it was clear that he was split in half. And after this much time, it was clear that Gene's higher calling was to be Gene Smith, the myth. A friend of mine had been the chief counsel for Governor Dukakis here, and he was a lawyer, and Steve Rosenfeld, for you lawyer types, and he helped me set up Gene and I to set up a nonprofit, a 501c3. And we had the first meeting at my house. At the time, my partner Jim and I had a house that out in Wellesley. and we had our first meeting, and you said 1999, right? And in this room, it was basically Leonard and I were in that. Janet came along not long after, but right, you weren't in the first thing. So
is that what is your
September 99.
1999.
Tom was there too.
No, it was Bill Hinman. It was Shelley Rubin.
Yes.
And she sort of factors into as my story evolves. So we set Gene up in that. He continued, working with Wisdom, and we were launching TBRC. He moved into a bigger apartment because he had a little small place, and moved his books into his bigger apartment.
Yeah, Ridge Avenue.
On Ridge Avenue in Cambridge. And so he was, he had his books, and he was doing the Gene thing, and he was also it was clear that he was under pressure because it was expensive to have a big, that size apartment, 5 bedrooms or something in Cambridge. So the Rubens came along, and they were launching Donald and Shelley. Shelley was on the board at TBRC. They were launching the Rubin Museum, so they basically lured Gene away, made him an offer, and it was one of those symbiotic relationships. They needed, or they could use the celebrity of Gene to sort of authentic, just a crusty exterior. He was in India. We were having a board meeting on a Friday in 2010 in New York in the Rubin Foundation offices, where TBRC was located at the time. And the whole board's assembled in New York to meet the next morning. And that Thursday night, I get a call in the hotel I was staying at that Gene had passed. And it was like sort of amazing that it happened when the board was all collected, because it was very important that we got together the next day, I think, and we were there for the staff, that there was some sense of something to. And then that morning, we, the board, got to go sit with Gene's body in the sort of catacomb-like funeral home, or the sitting room that they had, and his casket was in the front of the room. And I just remembered this. I called it, I think, magical thinking once before, but it was clear that Gene had this, there was this very, for me, a very powerful presence in the room. So anyway, there you go.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned, Kelsang Lhamo, the most learned Tibetan woman in North America, probably, not in North America for sure, and a poet and writer, has just composed another magisterial biography, this time of Gene Smith, and she wants to read a portion of it today for us in Tibetan, and then Tenzin Dickie will translate.
Do you have the English?
네,
Can
네.
I-
예, 로에메.
Oh, she's not reading. That's good. I don't have to. I don't have to translate something you read.
Just entering the Gene, 가르치는 people catching the 유명 기고 dit. Just 야고 삼성선.
Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why Gene Smith is important to Tibetans.
당부 아주 벽이 답배자 송럽라 벽배자. 다당부 추게 남주는 고추네 제 아니 그 땜방아다 당치더 담시부 로시자 되게 버를 첩시 야마 유여르데 이내 벽이 배차대 단답하지 못해 약하지네 열스.
So from the beginning of the establishment of Buddhism in Tibet, under the royal kings of Tibet, since then followed by the period of the early diffusion and the later diffusion of Buddhism, then followed by the fall of the empire and the spread of Buddhism. There's 로십자
갔으면
그래?
버시부
Oh.
의다 갔으면.
Then there was a period of fragmentation of over 400 years. So basically, over that period, do you need me to hold the mic as well?
Yeah.
Okay. So over that period, the politics of Tibet, the Tibetan polis, there's been ups and downs and many changes. But through that period, there's always been Buddhism. There's always been the growth and the continuity of Buddha Dharma in Tibet.
아다 드럽 중이 전에 제동이 야급주 것이 뭐라 펜차 창마 다 지마 양양레스 안데네 안 갈리갈리 신바 고츠브레 이네 따게 망치시지 아니 고셔당 아니 김바 고자 가실레 매장 지단 캡라디 충주질에 친요 말해서.
So before about 1294, what we had were manuscripts, texts that were written by hand. And then afterwards, then we had block printing in Tibet. But even then, what really happened was it was monks and it was the aristocracy and the elite who were working with the texts. It wasn't really the common people.
이내 안주 줄라가 창마 아니 배책 장사 열스 아니 지동구야 납중하고 다 창매 신세래 납중하고 다 대제리네 사직ገብ로 아니 안주 학방당 관대 창마 도시당 버신 창마 랍자가게 장신스 강배 방제스 니치당 곱자 감 안더 쪽제 아니 가시 출어요 가시 루스 된제전에 아니 자외천에 아니 자매 당버레서.
So there were so many texts. There were just an enormous amount of texts in the libraries, in the monasteries, in all of these different institutions. But then beginning with 1959, and then later, of course. So what happened in 1959 and then afterwards with the Cultural Revolution, then there was so many, like almost all of these texts were destroyed. They were ruined. A lot of the, for instance, texts were thrown into the water. Some of them were destroyed to make fertilizer for the fields. So there was just this massive plateau-wide destruction and ruin of Tibetan texts.
아니 가사 가셰 아미 가셰 라삼제 가셰게다 베자 망고지 당 줄라간 고송토데 망고지 리간 배열데 가셰 중에 차견게 매 차차브레 가셰니 인 백행 코랑 인 통제 인 간서 치료발을 제 라요 말했어.
And of course, so a lot of texts were destroyed. Others were buried, texts, and then also, of course, statues and other important religious objects. And some of these, the people who buried them died or forgot. So a lot of them were just lost forever. Others were sold.
Yeah, this and it. And 지동 양업증하고네 주주 레시바도 아니 베바 망보지다 저 capture 윤두 아니 가시니 가보 잠래 관계 계야요 말에 딱구자당 총바다 미상 침부 가시에겐 수낭제 차장 계도요래 이내 베바 야장업주 잠게 아니 잘라 관계 계마도네 당가당 배차당 아니 구당 두주케긴 더 제브레스 된다고 이제 엔 토마다 레지 capture 윤두 배유 주 아삼도 줄레데 엔 또고 강에 차네 엔 장마 밤송 쇼브레스.
So between the years of 1959 and 64, there were a lot of Tibetan refugees who were coming into exile, leaving Tibet to come to exile. And a lot of them, of course, they came out with nothing. They left everything behind and couldn't take anything with them. But then there were others, maybe the aristocracy, other people who were better off. They could take some things out. But even then, when people had to leave and come out, the things that they managed to carry and the things that they chose to carry with them, literally across their backs, these were the texts. Maybe I can't picture the picture can layer line, but yeah. Okay. So the people who could carry things, they would bring texts as they were coming across the mountains into exile. And when they came into exile, so through Assam, Bhutan, Nepal, a lot of them, they had to sell them because it was the only thing that they were carrying. So often they had to sell them to survive. And then, so in these ways, some of these texts now they're in museums across all over, and then some of them are lost.
동갈로 산책을 전에 단다 하여 버다게 콘주 단다 공바다게 하여 버다게 뭐마 도시 나오다 장복이 숨져 찍래 lungu요 말해서 단다 공바도 좀 하여.
So that means that the Tibetan texts that are now remaining after everything that happened, the texts that are now remaining in Tibetan monasteries and institutions, Thungar Lobsang Tilne, the scholar Thungar Lobsang Tilne has said maybe about 1/3 of the texts are now remaining, and they're in she can tell you the names of the monasteries and the institutions where the texts are still.
Beijing Miri Potang Potala Jebung Sagya Gunchen Degi Bakang Bebung Shechen Jakyung Janglong Gumba Nango Gun Anzum Chokar Lara Jashiki Gumbun Jambaling. That's all. Dan Jinla, the Saturn La Shudu, Lopchon Zodi, Bebe Kerub, Dang Chunchung called numbers, Jazan Koran la Mixegi catch the Berg, Dalu, Dan Berg Nang, the Becha da Son of the Mantu Pevale, Mang Chewaji Koran la Yunga Chade, Yoris, the Janetta, and that the Toland to the Korange, that the Tishoram Cutting and the Koranga Luju Shimbetonati, Sungyob Chiala Korange, the Kulung Semki Jambres.
So when Jann was studying in Seattle, he began to study Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan history. And as he began to study this, he began to he basically became a scholar. He just became Lorgyukeba, and he also became this Tibetan historian. He became a great scholar of Tibetan history, and so he began to really care about the history and the texts, and that was when. And he began to care about this, and he had this expertise even more than Tibetans. So he realized, when he realized the extent of what was lost, he realized the importance of recovering what remained and the importance of preservation.
That is Jagal Pedu and Chitong with June to Rangapoto Dansadang Dansa Chamboda and Comba Kalada, Penetsu in the Pecha Yomara, Pecha and Zindachilla Pecha Teagada, Pecha Loma Jazz, look to Jazz la Depchicley Yomare, Tisa Digang Pechimbo to your digital engine like a Baksatne, any Chuju can't sound me. Ani mirere kon de gansa sikim la tanda dire gansa Darjeeling la rupo thuse rumbo che kombal tiena ani ikcha to zo number tang an jakpa tang to zo jona ani pecha kange de changma sevres
So between the years of 1960 and then 65, Jann began to study at the Tibetan monasteries of Sera, Debung, and Ganden in India. And 65, sorry. Thanks. So yeah, 65. Like, but can't talk to you. Jann te sakala yores Rajani. No, any? Oh, okay. So from 60 to 65, he was in India, and he began to realize, he saw that at the Tibetan monasteries that they had this enormous lack of textbooks. They didn't have any textbooks. For 100 students in one class, they had one textbook. So he saw this great need that they had for textbooks and for curricular texts. And so from Buxa, he called all of these he called all of these people from Buxa to come to Sikkim from the different lineages. Yeah. Okay, to work on the printing of these texts. Okay. Yeah. To work on to print all these texts so that the monasteries all over that were just starting up in exile could have texts to study. And they began to... So then when Jann began working for the Library of Congress, he began to publish even more texts. Overall, he published over 8,000 texts, Tibetan texts, for people to use and to read and to study. And he wrote over 5,000 prefaces. Translation. Okay, he wrote. Preface He wrote over 5,000 prefaces for 5,000 texts. So that's what he did.
Jinla Tega ni get it in the so in the Mangaram get a share in Jinla Karach and the Chansa Gavio Marves. And you might take Mangaram and Jinla get it in any can I Chansa Karche Gao Mebesity and Jinla Ganga Tanda Legati. Kissing a chance of giving a Tande Legati Jitu Mare, Tande Legati, near Metzel Tiki, and Rintantem, but shingy those, and teaching a message chance of Gaya Mares, and Mangaranga, Sem Jobung and Industry those, Korangi Chansa de Bebe de Tangavre, Korangi Junzin, the kick Tatamambo Hashiji or something.
There's a question that I'd always wondered about, but I didn't really have the guts to ask Jann himself. So I asked Mangaram. Why did Jann never marry? And Mangaram said to me, Jann, his whole life, his first love, it's books, it's Tibetan books, and he wanted to spend his life on that cause. And he knew that if he got married, he wouldn't be able to have the same time and energy. So basically, Jann did get married, but to his books. And he spent his life with his books and with his Dalmatians.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful to hear. I want to say a few more things about what you just were talking about, but I'll start off with something else and then come back to that. So I actually now remember I did meet Jann in, it would have been 1974 in India, but very, very briefly. This was a time when I had been in Nepal and India for my own reasons, which I won't go into, but my head was in the clouds. But that was just one of the many amazing people that I was meeting. But I did, in fact, cross paths with him. But then I didn't really meet up with him again until I moved to Harvard. And this was the time that Tim was talking about, when Jann, for a little while, was up here in Massachusetts, in Somerville. And that's when I was asked to be on the board of advisors. Well, actually, no, that's also not true. Before that, while I was in Amherst College, so in the 90s, when I'm doing all of my Tibetological research, and this is the first point that I want to make, of course, I knew who Jann Smith was. I came down to New York many times. Jann Smith single-handedly put the field of Tibetology into existence, and literally, every major Tibetologist, pretty much in the world, was deeply helped and influenced by Jann Smith. Everybody, all of my friends, everyone I knew, we all went to Jann Smith. Where do I find a book on this? Who wrote about that? What's the history of this? And so you went to visit Jann Smith, and you took a big empty notebook with you, and he would start talking, and you would just like, oh my God, and this one, and this one, and this one. And then I would go home, and for the next 5 years, literally, I'm not joking, would look up all those things and become my research. But it's not only me, it was for everyone. So my main interaction with him, and my immense gratitude to him, was how generously he shared all his knowledge just to all of us. It was just amazing. So that's sort of my first point about Jann Smith. My second point is just to mention that I feel a very deep, a special connection with Jann Smith, because I also was a student of Deshung Rinpoche. That was after Jann was already in India, and I had only heard that Jann Smith was this famous person, but I actually spent a whole summer one time living in Deshung Rinpoche's house in Seattle, Washington, and I can only tell you that, the real guru of Jann Smith is Deshung Rinpoche. Deshung Rinpoche himself is he's from the Derge area, exactly where, what? Ga, that's right, of course. So he's from Ga, but he came to the United States invited by Terrell Wiley, one of the great the first Western Tibetologists to have a position in an American university. And Terrell Wiley knew who Deshung Rinpoche was and invited him to Seattle. And actually, Deshung Rinpoche in the late 60s was actually a faculty member at the University of Washington. And also at the time, Deshung Rinpoche's niece was married to the head of the one of the two palaces of the Sakya school, the Punto Podran. So they were living in Seattle. But anyway, I had an incredible summer when I lived with Deshung Rinpoche and his brother and his sister, who spoke absolutely no English, and they're all speaking their Kamke. But Deshung Rinpoche was enormously knowledgeable. So talk about a historian. He just had full control of the entire corpus of every kind of literature. I mean, he was a Sakya, but he knew absolutely everything. So I know by induction that the kind of knowledge that Deshung Rinpoche had was transmitted to Jann Smith early on. And in my view, Jann Smith is just an American, I want to say Golem, having been in Prague recently, but Jann Smith is a kind of messenger, or a kind of Ponya, exactly, an enactor of Deshung Rinpoche's vision. But then I myself feel a very special connection with Jann, because I myself also, I mean, I never became a Jann Smith. That's not even my style. So I'm nothing like Jann Smith at all. But I do feel that connection with Deshung Rinpoche. Just to talk about what Gene Smith accomplished when he was in India, and we're getting this story from a variety of perspectives. So he's going, he left Dzogchen Rinpoche, I think, to study more of Tibetan Buddhism, and he went to India, and he's running around in India during these early years when all these Tibetan refugees are coming out, and they're going to places like Buxa and so on. And then at some point he gets hired by the Library of Congress, probably because they could see, how much he knew about Tibetan literature, so he could be of value to the Library of Congress. It was the genius of Gene Smith to recognize, given this PL 480 kind of deal. So the main thing was India owed the United States government a lot of money, but was not able to pay it back. So the idea was, instead of paying it back in cash, they could pay it back in books. And so the PL 480 includes not only Tibetan literature, but all sorts of Indian literature, Hindi and every kind of literature from the entire South Asian continent, including Nepal as well. But Gene Smith realized that he could get on this incredible bandwagon. And this became a way for him to start to be able to pay for the reproduction and publication of the Tibetan books, because they had a guaranteed buyer from all the universities in the United States. So given that these publishers knew that all these universities would buy these books because it's part of the PL 480 collection, that at the same time, more books could be published, and those books could be distributed to the Tibetans in the monasteries and schools who needed them. So it was like a win-win situation. It then made it possible for all the Tibetans who were missing all of their books to have many, many more copies, and at the same time get these books preserved in all these American university libraries. So it was an amazing brilliance on Gene Smith's part. And I was going to tell the same story that Kelsang Lhamo told about, the whole idea of all these people coming out of Tibet, not only the elite and the aristocracy, I would say, but often it's the case that, very humble monks, when they're running out the door, what do they grab is the books, the one or two books that they put on their back to carry out too. So it was this, enormous pouring into South Asia of this massive amount of literature that people were bringing out, even though so much was lost, but still also so much was brought out. So it was an amazing time. But then just to say that, there's no question in my mind whatsoever that Gene Smith was an incarnate bodhisattva. If there's anything true about the idea of a tulku or reincarnation, there's no question that Gene Smith is a reincarnation of some major lama. But there's just some. I just wanted to talk about his bearing and how he was as a human being. I never was really a personal friend of his. I think also because I knew him when he was older and things were more serious and stuff. But there was a way, for one thing, he had an incredible prophetic vision. So not only did he figure out how to publish the books, but then this whole idea of, gathering a library and at the same time that digitalization, that reproduction, that of course then after that the internet, all these things were sort of happening one by one. Gene, who, when you met him, he didn't seem like the hippest or even the youngest guy on the block, but he could totally see the technology. He could see its promise. He could see what it could do. And he just okay, yeah, we're going to do that. We're going to do that. We're going to do that. And he had this way of cutting through all the BS, that anything that stood in his way, and he actually got the job done in an amazing way. And I won't mention names, but there were many others in the world of Tibetan studies who were had a sort of inkling of a similar kind of idea, and none of them could ever get done. And I think both Leonard and myself, we both felt, and why we were so attached to him, because Gene was the guy who got the stuff done. He said what he was going to do, and he photographed all these things. He started cataloging them. He was hired all these people, and he got the stuff done. So he was operating out of a kind of he knew what he was doing, and he was just going there, and he succeeded. It worked, which is quite really astonishing. So I have no question that he was a bodhisattva. It's also the way that Gene was as a person. I mean, that's why I find it hard to imagine really being personally close to him. He was just he was like a phenomenon. He was just like, and there was a certain, I don't know, it's really hard to put in words, but he always knew exactly what he was doing. He always had a sort of half smile on his face. One of the surprising things, though, about him was, in addition to being such a good scholar, and really a nerd, of the highest order, he was also really good at talking to people, and also talking to very wealthy people and getting people to support him. And that's the part about him knowing everyone. And, I would sometimes come down to talk Tibetology with him, and he wanted to talk to me about people. And I don't know any of those guys at all. And so he was saying, do you know so-and-so? Nah, I don't know. But that was like the other side of him, of really getting like things done. So I'm looking at my notes. That was like the main thing that I wanted to say, is the kind of inspiration that he just had as a person. And,
Charisma.
What?
Charisma.
Yeah, I wouldn't, it's not exactly charisma per se. It's sort of like an undercurrent.
Understated charisma.
Yeah, an understated charisma. One was very attracted to him. I'll say that for myself, not only was I a student of Deshung Rinpoche, but as soon as I saw Gene Smith, if Gene Smith told me to do anything, jump off roof, I would do it. I mean, so he would, no, seriously, because Gene Smith had the vision, and I believed in it too. And so when he, for example, asked me to be on the board of advisors for, once I moved to Harvard, so I was in the area, and, of course I would do that, because you want to get on the, the boat of this guy who, whatever. But he really had a kind of a certainty. He was all, as you say, he was married to his books. I don't think I want to use actually that metaphor, but he was the books, and he was just truly an incredible phenomenon. So we were lucky to know him. But the main thing is what you see now is the thing is still going, and it is just unbelievable resource, for Tibetan studies. That they're just like, you can, you search the database, anything that you're looking for, any word or anything, is just like enormous amount of knowledge. It's just like unbelievable. When I first started out in Tibetan studies, when none of this, there was no computer, there was no internet, never would have believed, when I did my doctoral dissertation on Tantong Gyalpo, and I knew there was maybe something about Tantong Gyalpo in a certain volume, there's no table of contents, there's no catalog, there's nothing. It was just like, are you, magically open the page and skip Tantong Gyalpo over there and like find it if you're really lucky, but nothing like the kind of resource that we have now. And maybe
Just before you are coming New York tomorrow, then today we have to prepare everything. Janet Gyatso is coming. You have to do that. You have to, Well, sometimes I do the sick call because you are looking for some text. We don't have it.
Really?
Jin said you need it. Sometimes it's Daksham Songbum something. Daksham Ninden Dojus. Yeah, Daksham Ninden Dojus. We just got the text from the Gongbo. You said, tomorrow Janet is coming. You have to find it. If we couldn't find it, almost beat us.
Buy a lot of blank CDs.
Sometimes I do the sick call.
Well, thank you. I didn't realize that was happening. I do remember having a conversation with him about Daksham Nyuden Dorje, and I have continued to be really intrigued by him. Somebody should do their doctoral dissertation on him and his life. Gene said he had an absolutely amazing life, But Gene was the one, he read all these biographies in particular, and that helped me a lot, but he was able to point to the, because I was asking him things like, which guys mention historical events, which guys are more, about everyday life, and he could tell you. I thought he knew that by heart, but it was actually Kelsang Lhamo. So wait a minute, I think that Kelsang Lhamo is the real bodhisattva, actually.
I know it many times.
And talk about marriage or some kind of, no, I won't say it. But it is true that, that this is a modern day Gene Smith here, and also here. Anyway,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for all those unforgettable stories and all those inspiring words about Gene, the founder of the organization, the man who set the vision and the vision and the high standards for us to try to keep up with. It's already 7:30, so I won't say anything more. If you're interested in updates on BDRC, what we're doing now, I think you get a sense that it's still a thriving organization, but if you'd like to learn more, please come up to see me or any of the other staff. And we'll just do a Q&A around the wine table. If you have questions, just let me know. Thanks so much. I want to invite another board member up to just give some closing remarks in 30 seconds or less.
30 seconds. Okay, very good. What's that? Yeah. So I'll do this very quickly. But anyway, I just thank you very much. This was really cool because it filled in a lot of kind of history that I didn't understand about some of the past. I didn't know Gene at all. For me, he was a totally mythical figure. The TBRC, when it began, was a totally mythical organization. I had come back from Japan around 1995. While I was there, I was working with a very famous Japanese scholar, Yanagita Seizon, who had a Swiss scholar working with him, Ursop, about digitizing East Asian text. And I got the bug of digitizing material. And everybody kept talking about this thing called TBRC. And so when I got back, I kind of kept my ears open, was working on some project, but everybody kept referring to this organization. I don't work on Tibetan materials, but when I came to Harvard, I think it was a lunch with you, Leonard, and Jeff Wallman, and asked me to be on the board. And I was like, Janet, that inertia of just like, it's been this mythical thing. So even in his passing, Gene's charisma carried over, and I immediately jumped in. And I remember just at a meeting that was out in Berkeley where people digitizing stuff from all over the world, and everybody who wanted information about this kind of work, where did they go? To all the TBRC people. This was where, and now the BDRC, was where the cutting edge work of digitization was happening. And even more importantly, and this is what has always most impressed me, was that all of this material was made available free to everyone. And that, I think, is, again, the kind of bodhisattva quality of all of it. So that's really all I'll say, is except to say that we want to keep this organization going. And I think the commitment of somebody of that feeling of what Gene started, what you all brought to the next level, and then what's happening now with on the digital side. So anyway, thank you. I guess I can thank everybody for coming, but also, if you know people out there that are willing to support this great organization to keep things free, talk to these people like Jann and others. So it's a really wonderful technologically, but also just the services providing for Tibetan scholars all over the world at this point. So thank you very much, and thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think people will want to stretch their legs. Yes. Thank you all. So please stay. We've got drinks, snacks. We run this place, so no one's going to tell us to shut down. Stay as long as you like.